The flashing lights cut through the warm Chicago evening like accusations. And before Blake could even process what was happening, Officer Ramirez had him slammed against the hood of his own car. "You think this is okay? Two guys making out at a stoplight like it's your living room?" The cop snarled, his breath hot against Blake's ear, while his partner kept Jameson pinned back on the sidewalk. Blake's heart hammered against the cold metal, the taste of Jameson's kiss still lingering on his lips from that innocent moment they'd shared at the red light. He'd only wanted to feel close after a long day at the community center where he volunteered teaching kids to read, but now every muscle in his body tensed under the weight of the officer's knee. "We weren't doing anything wrong," Blake managed to say, his voice steady even though fear clawed at his throat. Ramirez laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the nearby buildings. "Wrong? You fags are always wrong in my book. Hands behind your back." The cuffs clicked tight and Blake caught Jameson's wide-eyed stare across the street, pure panic mixed with something deeper like the fear they'd talked about so many times late at night. This wasn't their first brush with stares or whispers, but police. In the middle of a quiet neighborhood on the north side, Jameson tried to step forward, but the second officer shoved him back. "Stay put or you're next." Blake's mind raced. He knew the statistics, the stories from his friends, but living it felt different, raw and immediate. The crowd that had started to gather murmured, some pulling out phones, others shaking their heads. One woman whispered loud enough for him to hear, "Poor kid doesn't deserve this." Yet no one intervened. Ramirez yanked him upright and started patting him down roughly. "ID," he barked. Blake nodded toward his wallet still in the car. The officer grabbed it, flipped it open, and froze. The color drained from his face as he read the name again and again. Harrison? Blake Harrison. His partner glanced over and the same shock hit him. Blake straightened as much as the cuffs allowed, meeting their eyes without flinching. "That's right. Son of Commissioner Richard Harrison." The silence that followed was heavier than any blow. Ramirez's grip loosened instantly like he'd been burned. "Sir, we didn't know." Blake almost laughed at the sudden "sir," but the pain in his wrists and the humiliation burning in his chest kept it locked inside. Jameson was finally allowed to approach, his face pale but steady as he reached for Blake's arm. The officers fumbled with the cuffs, apologizing in a rush of words that sounded rehearsed and empty. "We'll file a report right away. This was a misunderstanding." Misunderstanding. The word hung there while Blake rubbed his wrists and stared at the men who moments ago had treated him like trash. Jameson pulled him close right there on the sidewalk, ignoring the lingering crowd. "You okay?" he whispered. Blake nodded, but inside something cracked open. He'd hidden his family name for years, walked away from his father's world after coming out at 21 because the rejection had cut too deep. Now that name, the one he'd buried under teaching gigs and quiet activism, had saved him in the worst way possible. The officers drove off with promises of follow-up, but Blake knew the real storm was just beginning. Back in their small apartment, Jameson made coffee, while Blake paced the living room, the city lights twinkling outside like nothing had happened. "They only stopped because of who my dad is," Blake said finally, his voice tight. Jameson set the mug down and wrapped his arms around him from behind. "Doesn't make what they did right. But maybe this is the universe forcing you to deal with it." Blake leaned into the embrace, the warmth of Jameson's chest against his back, the only steady thing in a night that had shattered his carefully built walls. He thought about his father, the man who hadn't spoken to him in 7 years, the commissioner who preached law and order, but couldn't accept his own son loving another man. Tomorrow he'd have to face that world again, but tonight, with Jameson's steady breathing beside him, Blake let himself feel the full weight of what had just shifted. The bullying wasn't over. It had only changed form, and now the consequences would ripple through every part of his life, pulling in people he loved and forcing choices he'd avoided for years. Morning light filtered through the blinds, painting stripes across the kitchen table where Blake sat staring at his phone. The missed calls from his father's office had started at 6 a.m. sharp. Jameson slid a plate of eggs in front of him and kissed the top of his head before heading to his shift at the hospital. "Call me if it gets bad," he said, his green eyes full of the quiet strength that had first drawn Blake to him 3 years ago, at a pride event downtown. Blake nodded, but the knot in his stomach tightened. He'd built a life without the Harrison name, teaching English to immigrant kids at the community center, volunteering at the LGBTQ youth shelter, pouring his energy into helping others so he wouldn't have to face his own unfinished business. Now one traffic stop had ripped the lid off everything. The drive to his father's office in the Loop felt like stepping back into a past he'd outrun. The commissioner's secretary ushered him in without a word, and there was Richard Harrison behind the massive oak desk, silver hair, perfectly combed, uniform crisp, even though he was behind a desk these days. Blake. The single word carried 7 years of silence. Blake sat down, uninvited, crossing his arms. You heard. His father's jaw tightened. The officers involved have been suspended pending investigation. But son, what were you thinking, kissing a man in public like that? Blake's laugh came out bitter. I was thinking I'm 30 years old and I love my boyfriend. Same thing I've been thinking since the day I left this house. The commissioner leaned forward, eyes narrowing, but there was something new in them, uncertainty. This puts me in a difficult position. The press is already sniffing around. Internal Affairs wants statements. Blake stood up, the chair scraping loud against the floor. Then maybe you should tell them the truth. That your own department harasses gay men and only stops when they realize the victim has power. He left before his father could reply, chest heaving as he stepped into the elevator. Outside the building, the city buzzed around him, taxis, honking, pedestrians rushing by, and Blake felt exposed for the first time in years. His phone buzzed with a text from Jameson. How'd it go? He typed back, like walking into a minefield, and headed to the community center where his kids waited. The afternoon passed in a blur of lesson plans and laughter, but Blake's mind kept drifting. At 3 o'clock, his best friend from the shelter, Marcus, pulled him aside in the hallway. Word travels fast, man. You okay? Blake shrugged, trying to smile. Just another day of being reminded who I am. Marcus clapped his shoulder. You're more than your dad's name and more than what those cops saw. Don't let them win. That night, Jameson came home exhausted from a 12-hour shift, but still made time to listen while Blake poured out every detail. They sat on the couch, Jameson's hand tracing slow circles on Blake's knee. I'm proud of you for facing him, Jameson said softly. But I'm scared too. What if this pulls you back into that world and you forget the life we built? Blake turned to face him, searching those familiar eyes. I won't forget. You're my world, Jameson. But I can't keep pretending the past doesn't exist. Not after yesterday. They fell asleep, tangled together, the city humming outside, but Blake's dreams were restless images of his father's face, shifting from anger to something almost like regret. The next morning, a reporter left a voicemail asking for comment on the commissioner's son and police misconduct. Blake deleted it, but the seed was planted. He couldn't hide anymore. The true identity he'd buried was demanding to be seen, and with it came choices that would test every relationship he held dear, including the one with the man sleeping peacefully beside him. Across town, Officer Ramirez sat in his squad car, staring at the suspension notice, wondering how one kiss at a stoplight had upended his entire career. Blake didn't know it yet, but the ripple effects were just starting to spread, touching lives he'd never imagined, touching his own in ways that would force growth none of them were ready for. The family dinner invitation arrived via courier the next afternoon, thick cream paper, embossed with the Harrison crest like something from another century. Blake stared at it for a full minute before showing it to Jameson, who read it over his shoulder and raised an eyebrow. Your dad wants to talk? After 7 years. Blake folded the card carefully. He wants damage control. But maybe there's more. Jameson didn't push, but Blake could feel the tension in the air as they drove to the big house in Lincoln Park that weekend. The gate swung open automatically and Blake's stomach twisted at the sight of the perfectly manicured lawn, the same one where he'd played catch as a kid before everything changed. His mother opened the door first, pulling him into a hug that smelled like Chanel and regret. Blake, my boy, you look so grown. Inside the dining room, his father waited at the head of the table, uniform replaced by a polo shirt that still somehow looked official. They ate in near silence, roast chicken and asparagus, the clink of silverware louder than any conversation. Finally, the commissioner set his fork down. I've reviewed the body cam footage. Those officers crossed a line. They're gone. Blake met his father's gaze. And what about the line you crossed when I told you I was gay? The words hung heavy. His mother reached for his hand, but Blake pulled back gently. Dad, I didn't come here for apologies. I came because maybe this mess can mean something. I've spent years helping kids who feel the same fear I felt that night. If you really want to fix things, start with the department's training. Jameson sat quietly beside him, offering silent support the way he always did. Later in the study, father and son faced each other alone. I was wrong, Blake, the commissioner said, voice rough. I thought I was protecting you from the world, but I was the one making it harder. Blake felt something loosen in his chest, not forgiveness exactly, but a crack in the wall. It's a start. They talked for hours, old wounds opening and closing until the city lights came on outside. Driving home, Jameson squeezed his knee. You did good tonight. But Blake knew the real test was coming. At work the following week, a parent at the community center pulled him aside after class. I heard about your father. My son's struggling with who he is. Could you talk to him? Blake agreed and soon found himself mentoring more kids than ever, the Harrison name now opening doors instead of closing them. Yet, with every new conversation, the weight grew. Jameson started working longer shifts, coming home distant. One night, Blake found him on the balcony staring at the skyline. What's wrong? Jameson turned, eyes tired. I love you, Blake. But sometimes I feel like I'm dating two people, the man I fell for and the commissioner's son who's suddenly everywhere. The misunderstanding stung, but Blake pulled him close. You're dating me. The whole me. And I'm choosing us every day. They kissed under the stars, slow and reassuring, but Blake felt the first real fracture in their foundation. Across the city, Officer Ramirez, who'd been quietly reinstated after a review, reached out through a mutual contact asking for a meeting. Blake agreed, meeting the man at a neutral coffee shop downtown. I was wrong that night, Ramirez said, hands wrapped around his mug. I let my own biases run the show. Your father's changes are making me rethink everything. Blake listened, the apology landing differently now that he'd faced his own family. Actions matter more than words, he replied. Show me. As weeks passed, Blake balanced the new family dinners with late nights, planning a youth summit at the shelter. Jameson supported him, but the distance lingered, small misunderstandings piling up like unpaid bills. One evening, after a particularly tough meeting with city officials, Blake came home to find Jameson packing a bag. I need space, he said, voice breaking. Just for a few days. I feel like I'm losing you to this identity you never wanted. Blake's heart cracked. Don't go. But Jameson left anyway, the door closing softly behind him. Alone in the apartment, Blake sat on the couch, replaying every choice, wondering if revealing his true self had cost him the one person who'd loved him without conditions. The growth he'd craved was here, painful and real, but the price felt higher than he'd ever imagined. Yet somewhere deep down, a quiet voice whispered that this was the path forward, even if it hurt. The youth summit planning consumed Blake's days, filling the empty spaces Jameson had left behind. He threw himself into workshops, scheduling speakers and coordinating with City Hall, where his father's influence now worked in his favor. Marcus from the shelter became his right-hand man, staying late to help brainstorm activities that would make the kids feel seen. You're changing things, Blake, Marcus said one night over takeout. Not just for these kids, for the whole community. Blake smiled, but the ache in his chest never quite faded. He texted Jameson every evening, simple check-ins that went mostly unanswered until one Thursday when the reply finally came. I miss you too. Coffee tomorrow? They met at their favorite cafe, the one with the mismatched chairs and the barista who remembered their orders. Jameson looked tired but whole. I was scared, he admitted, stirring his latte. Scared that the world you're stepping into would swallow the quiet life we had. Blake reached across the table, taking his hand. It won't. I'm still the guy who burns toast and leaves socks everywhere. The commissioner stuff is just one piece. They talked for hours, rebuilding the bridge one honest word at a time. Back at the apartment that night, they fell into each other's arms, not with passion but with the deep relief of coming home. The next morning Blake woke to a voicemail from an old colleague, a journalist who wanted to profile the Harrison family reconciliation for a national magazine. Blake almost deleted it, but then thought of the kids at the shelter, the ones still hiding from their own parents. "Okay," he told the reporter. "But only if we focus on the change, not the drama." The interview went live 2 weeks later, and suddenly Blake's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Invitations to speak at universities, requests for advice from other families. Through it all, Jameson stood steady, attending meetings, holding his hand during tough calls. Yet new challenges emerged at the community center. A board member who'd never liked Blake's open approach started questioning his agenda. "We're a family organization," the man said in a closed-door meeting. "All this gay stuff might scare donors." Blake met his eyes calmly. "This gay stuff is saving lives. If that scares people, maybe the donors need to change." He walked out, heart-pounding but certain. That evening he told Jameson the story, and they laughed together, the sound healing something deep inside. Across town, his father called, inviting both of them to a department fundraiser. "Bring Jameson," the commissioner said. "It's time the force sees the whole picture." Blake hesitated, but Jameson squeezed his hand. "We'll go. Together." The fundraiser was held in a glittering downtown ballroom, officers in dress uniforms mingling with city leaders. When Blake and Jameson walked in hand, the room quieted for a moment, then resumed with a new energy. Ramirez approached first, extending a hand to both of them. "Thank you for giving me a second chance," he said quietly. Blake shook it, feeling the shift not just in the officer but in himself. Later his father pulled him aside near the dessert table. "I'm proud of you, son. Really." The words Blake had waited years to hear landed softly without fanfare, but they settled deep. Driving home, Jameson rested his head on Blake's shoulder. Tonight felt like progress. Blake nodded, but inside he knew progress wasn't linear. The next week brought a new crisis, a young man at the shelter named Tyler who'd been kicked out by his family after coming out. Blake spent hours helping him find housing, listening to his fears, and seeing his own younger self in the boy's eyes. "You're not alone," Blake told him. "Not anymore." Tyler's gratitude was quiet but real, and Blake realized this was the real work, the daily choices that built a life worth living. Jameson started volunteering at the shelter too, his medical skills helping with checkups, and the two of them fell into a rhythm that felt stronger than before. Yet Blake could sense another layer waiting, the final test that would force him to decide once and for all what kind of man he wanted to be. The call came on a rainy Tuesday from Internal Affairs. They wanted him to testify in a larger investigation into department biases, using his own experience as a starting point. Blake stared at the phone, knowing this could make real change or burn every bridge he'd just rebuilt. He looked at Jameson asleep on the couch and made his choice. The hearing room smelled of old wood and fresh coffee. Blake sat at the long table with his notes steady despite the cameras in the back row. Jameson had taken the day off to sit in the audience, offering silent strength with every glance. Blake's father was there too, in the front row, uniform sharp, but his face showed the strain of the past months. When Blake took the stand, the room hushed. 7 years ago, I left my family because I was told my love made me less. He began, voice clear and measured. Last month, officers treated me the same way until they learned my last name. That name shouldn't matter. No one's identity should protect them or condemn them. He spoke for 20 minutes, laying out recommendations for training, body cams, and accountability. The questions that followed were tough, but Blake answered each one with the quiet confidence he'd earned through late nights and hard conversations. When it ended, applause rippled through the room, small but genuine. Outside, Jameson pulled him into a hug right there on the courthouse steps. "You were incredible." But the real cost came later that week, when Blake's father called, sounding older than his years. "Some officers are pushing back hard. They're saying I'm soft because of you." Blake closed his eyes. "Then stand up to them, Dad. Show them what real strength looks like." The conversation stretched long into the night, father and son navigating new territory of mutual respect mixed with lingering pain. At the shelter, Tyler's situation worsened. His family threatened legal action to force him home. Blake spent days on the phone with lawyers using every connection his name now gave him to secure emergency custody. Jameson stayed up late researching medical options for Tyler's anxiety, the two of them working side by side like partners in every sense. "We're building something real here," Jameson said one midnight pouring coffee. Blake smiled, tired but full. "Yeah, we are." Yet the sacrifice hit hardest when Marcus pulled Blake aside after a group session. The board voted. They want to cut the LGBTQ programs, citing donor pressure. Blake felt the floor tilt. This place had been his anchor for years. He called an emergency meeting, spoke passionately about the kids who had nowhere else to go, and in the end, the board reversed the decision by one vote. The victory felt hollow, knowing how close he'd come to losing it all. That night, Blake sat on the roof with Jameson, sharing a blanket against the autumn chill. "I keep thinking, what if I'd stayed hidden?" he admitted. "Would life be simpler?" Jameson turned to him, eyes bright. "Simpler, maybe. But not better. You're changing lives, Blake. Including mine." They stayed up talking until dawn, mapping dreams for the future, a bigger shelter, maybe even a foundation. The next morning, Blake woke to news that his testimony had sparked statewide reviews. Officers were retraining, policies shifting. His father texted a single word: "Proud." Blake stared at it for a long time, the single syllable carrying more weight than any speech. Yet inside he felt the final pieces clicking into place, the man he'd been, the man he was becoming, all merging into someone ready to stand fully in his truth. When Jameson proposed a weekend getaway to the cabin up north, Blake said yes without hesitation. They packed light, drove north, laughing like the early days, stopping at roadside stands for apple cider. At the cabin, under a sky full of stars, Jameson took his hand. "Whatever comes next, we face it together." Blake kissed him softly, the moment simple and perfect. But even in that peace, he knew one more truth remained to be faced, the choice that would define everything. The cabin weekend stretched into a week of quiet mornings and long hikes, Blake and Jameson rediscovering the easy rhythm that had first brought them together. One evening by the fire, Jameson pulled out a small box, handing it to Blake with a shy smile. Inside was a simple silver key. "To our future," he said. "I found a bigger place downtown, closer to the shelter and the hospital. Room for Tyler if he needs it. Room for us to grow." Blake's throat tightened as he slipped the key onto his chain, right next to the one for their old apartment. Yes. They drove back to the city, renewed and ready. The shelter threw a small celebration for the new programs. Blake's father attended in civilian clothes, shaking hands with kids who'd once feared anyone in uniform. Tyler stood taller now, his custody secured, and his smile genuine when he hugged Blake goodbye before heading to his new foster home. "You showed me it gets better," the boy said. Blake watched him go, feeling the full circle of his own journey. At the community center, the board presented him with a plaque for outstanding service, and Blake accepted it with a laugh, remembering how close he'd come to losing it all. Marcus clapped him on the back. "You did it, man." Even Officer Ramirez stopped by one afternoon to volunteer for a career day, talking to the kids about second chances. "Your dad's changes saved my career," he told Blake privately. "I won't waste it." Life settled into a new normal, richer and more honest than before. Blake still taught his classes, still mentored, still spoke out, but now he did it with Jameson at his side and his father in his corner. One crisp Sunday, they all gathered at the big house in Lincoln Park for brunch, laughter filling the rooms that had once held only silence. Blake caught his father watching him and Jameson with a soft expression he'd never seen before. Later, on the back porch, his dad clapped him on the shoulder. "You taught me more than I taught you, son." The words landed like a final key turning in a lock. That night back home, Blake and Jameson stood on their new balcony overlooking the glowing city. Jameson rested his head on Blake's shoulder. "We made it." Blake smiled, pulling him closer. "We did. And we're just getting started." The journey hadn't been easy, the bullying, the misunderstandings, the sacrifices, all of it had forged something unbreakable. In the quiet, Blake thought about the boy he'd been, the man he'd become, and the love that had walked beside him every step. The true identity he'd once hidden now shone openly, not as a shield, but as a light guiding others forward. As the city lights twinkled below, he felt at peace for the first time in years. Was revealing one's true identity the key to dismantling prejudice, or did it simply prove how much deeper the work of acceptance truly runs?